Okay, so we've got a little distressing demo on this flag that's in the model. So first thing that you're going to start with is putting down the base layer. So we're picking whatever the lightest is. There's no pure white in this, except for I have laid a little line, you can see, of frisket to preserve that like highlight along the edge of the American flag billboard thing. I'm mixing a bit of yellow, I've created a little bit of green, a little bit of brown, all mixed together to create sort of like muddy color. It's actually going to dry very pale. It looks really dark on the page, but it's going to dry pale. We're using quite a bit of water in it to lower the overall value of the page and get it that kind of nice muddy beginning. We're also going to start with some distressing. So I'm taking a toothbrush, a little damp, I'm rubbing it into a brown, and while that's still wet, I'm spattering it. So while it's wet, that spatter is going to become less specific. It's going to dry, it's going to be softer. I'm going to do a second layer of spattering now that I've entirely dried that with a green, and you can see it stays much finer, it's much grittier. So when you spatter onto a wet surface, it sort of has that blooming, softening effect. It creates a less high contrast. When we spatter onto dry surfaces, we keep more of the texture of it. So I'm going to mix the red here. I'm mixing it with a bit of brown, and I'm using a dry brushing technique. So I've got that thin, kind of crappy acrylic brush that I like to use. I'm using it very dry, and I'm creating some long strokes with it. You can also get it very, very dry and kind of scrub to create soft patterning, which is more what I'm doing here. And then if I were to do it wet, this is what it would look like up on the top. So you lose a lot of that texture, but you can let that layer dry down and then go over it with a more concentrated, drier approach to create more of the overall texture. So if you just need it to be red to begin with, or brown, which is what I'm adding back in here, and then you can create the texture on top of it with something with more opacity. So I'm mixing my browns and my reds to create something that's more specific to this. It's not a true American flag, right? It's got a lot of other colors going on. So I'm also using it to lay in these shadows that are blue on the outside corners, and then I'm softening them by getting that brush just a little bit wet, picking up some of that muddy green color and just going around the outside edges so that it doesn't seem, so it's a little blended in, it's not so stark. That's my dog, my apologies. I'm creating some thin washes here. So, and then I'm going to let those entirely dry down. So I'm just creating a couple different areas that we're going to end up doing a lot of layers on top of this to make it, you know, the level of both the structure and how saturated we want it to be. So to create the stars, I've actually created little dots, like little dots of frisket, and then I'm using a sharp object to create star shapes out of each of them, which is working pretty well for me. I tried to create a stamp, which you could maybe do if you wanted to work with acrylic on top of it, but we'd lose some of the color. So the hope here is that this is preserving this underlayer of like muddy green that we've created in order to not have it be too much of a highlight, but it'll work better as a base for these stars. Now, since this is just a demo, I'm not going to do all of them, and I definitely put them just a little too close, but I wanted to show you a technique that I use to do them. So if you use this, one of mine got a little drier, it didn't have enough frisket in it to begin with, so I'm laying another little dot on top of it, and then just pulling those little corners out. Worked really well. So we're going to let that entirely dry. The frisket's dry now, so I can start adding in my blues for the background of this. I'm using a big brush and doing a nice thin wash over the whole thing to begin with, knowing that I'm going to end up dry brushing and like adding texture on top of it. This area up here has some different variations of blue, so I did add a little bit more green in sort of the middle versus it goes to blue with a little bit of, I'm using cobalt with a touch of black in it on the outside edges and to muddy up the corners. I'm not working very wet with anything because I want it to dry fairly quickly so I can keep establishing texture, and also because it's just frustrating to like work with something that wet when we're working inside of like stripes and geometry. So I'm using a little bit of a stippling technique. I'm pretty loaded with paint. It's pretty dry, but also lots of pigment on this brush, and you can see that I'm letting I'm using kind of a scrubbing motion. Feathering it out into the stripes as well as we build up texture here. So this is more of a stippling. You can kind of stipple things in. That works really well, especially when we're working with something that has so much distressing in it. Now that I'm looking at how dark that got, I'm realizing I need to get a little darker along this outside edge to create balance. Also letting that top layer dry down a little bit, and there's a little bit of like a blue shadow coming up through here. I can do that with a bit of a dry brushing, stippling, as well as kind of scrubbing it in, or we could lay it in a little wetter, but I like the texture that the outside edges get with this. So that's entirely dried now. I can pull up my Frisket on my stars. They are way too bright, which we can see, which is the difficulty of Frisket. Even though it had that layer of paint underneath it, it also picks up a little bit of the pigment of that. So I'm just taking a little bit of our colors we've already mixed, reactivating them with water, and kind of blotting them back in over, not the whole star, but kind of randomly over the top of it to help marry them into the background. Now, some of you have colors on the back of this that have maybe, like a red light cast across it or something like that. Not only can you preserve your lights, as I did in this kind of like section right underneath the stars, but you can use just a passive color over the top layer to paint your light coming back through. You could also underpaint it at the beginning, but sometimes that's a little hard when we're dealing with so many different colors. So this is what it looks like dry, and I hope that helped with your process.